The transport ship touched down on Velar Prime with barely a whisper. Helen Carter pressed her hand against the cold window and looked out at the alien world that would be her home for the next year. The sky was a pale purple, and the buildings stretched up like silver needles reaching for the clouds. Everything looked clean and perfect, and somehow empty. She was the first human teacher to ever step foot on this planet. The cultural exchange program had taken 3 years to arrange. They were known across the galaxy for their advanced technology and their strict social order. What they were not known for was warmth. The airlock opened with a hiss. Helen picked up her single bag and walked down the ramp. 3 waited for her at the bottom. They were tall and thin, with smooth skin and large, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything. They wore identical dark robes that covered them from neck to floor. The one in the middle stepped forward. His movements were precise and controlled. "You are Helen Carter from Earth," he said. It was not a question. His voice was flat and showed no emotion. "Yes, I am. Thank you for welcoming me to your world. I am Director of the Education Council. This is Instructor and Instructor. We will show you to your quarters and explain your duties." Helen waited for something more, a greeting perhaps or a question about her journey. Nothing came. The 3 turned and began walking toward a nearby building. Helen followed. They moved through corridors that all looked the same. White walls, bright lights, and silence. Helen heard no voices, no laughter, no sounds of life. They passed groups of young in the hallways. The students walked in straight lines. They did not speak to each other. They did not look around. They simply moved from one place to another like machines. "Your living quarters are here," Director said, stopping at a door. "You will begin teaching tomorrow at the 6th bell. Do not be late. Lateness is not acceptable." "Of course. Can you tell me more about the students I'll be teaching?" "You will teach the failure group. 12 students who cannot perform at acceptable levels. We believe human teaching methods may be suited to such inferior minds. If you succeed in improving their memorization scores, it will prove useful. If you fail, it will prove that human methods are as primitive as we suspect." Helen felt her jaw tighten but kept her voice calm. "I see. May I observe other classes before I begin teaching?" Director tilted his head slightly. "That is acceptable. Instructor will escort you at the 4th bell." He turned and walked away without another word. The other 2 followed him in silence. Helen entered her quarters and sat down on the narrow bed. The room was small and bare. 1 bed, 1 desk, 1 chair, nothing on the walls, nothing soft or comfortable. She thought about her classroom back on Earth, full of color and books and student artwork. She thought about the sounds of children laughing and asking questions. She had known this would be difficult, but now, seeing this place, she wondered if she had made a mistake. The next morning, Instructor came to collect her. They walked to the main education building. It was even larger than Helen had imagined. Thousands of students filled its halls, all silent, all moving in perfect order. Led her to a classroom and gestured for her to enter. Helen stepped inside and stood at the back of the room. 50 students sat in perfect rows. They all faced forward. Their hands were folded on their desks. No one moved, no one whispered. The instructor at the front of the room spoke in a flat monotone. "The chemical composition of our atmosphere is 72% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, 4% argon, and 3% other elements. Repeat." The students repeated the words exactly. Every single one of them said the same thing at the same time in the same tone of voice. "The distance from our planet to our sun is 147 million kilometers. Repeat." Again, the students repeated the words perfectly. This continued for 2 hours. The instructor would state a fact. The students would repeat it. No one asked why. No one asked how. No one asked anything at all. Helen felt sick to her stomach. This was not teaching. This was programming. Showed her 3 more classes. They were all the same. Different subjects, different facts, but the same dead method. Students memorizing without understanding. Learning without thinking. "These are our best students," said with something that might have been pride. "They can memorize over 500 facts per day. They never question. They never make errors. They are perfect." "They're not learning," Helen said quietly. "Learning is memorization. What else would it be?" Helen did not answer. She was beginning to understand what she was really facing here. At the 6th bell brought her to a small room at the edge of the education building. 12 young sat inside. They were smaller than the others Helen had seen, and they did not sit in perfect order. Some slouched in their chairs. Some looked at the walls or the floor. One was drawing something on a piece of paper with his finger. "These are the failures," said coldly. "They cannot memorize efficiently. They ask questions. They become distracted. They are defective. You may attempt to fix them if you wish. We have already given up." She left the room and closed the door. Helen walked to the front of the small classroom and looked at the 12 young faces. They stared back at her with their large, dark eyes. She saw something in those eyes that she had not seen in any other student. She saw curiosity. She saw life. One of them raised his hand slowly, as if expecting to be punished. "Yes," Helen said gently. "You are the human," the young said. His voice was soft and uncertain. My name is Helen Carter. What's your name?" "It's nice to meet you." "Why are you here?" he asked. "Humans are supposed to be primitive. Why would a primitive species teach us?" The other students made small sounds of shock. Asking why was clearly forbidden. Helen smiled for the first time since arriving on Velar Prime. "That," she said, "is an excellent question, and I think you're going to find that the answer is much more interesting than any fact you've ever memorized." His eyes widened. For just a moment, something like hope flickered across his face. Helen looked at her 12 students and felt something shift inside her chest. These were not failures. These were children whose spirits had not yet been completely crushed. These were minds that still wanted to understand, not just repeat. She pulled a chair over and sat down among them instead of standing at the front. The students looked confused. "I'm not going to teach you the way you've been taught before," Helen said. "I'm going to teach you how to think. I'm going to teach you how to ask questions and find answers. I'm going to teach you that learning is not about memorizing facts. It's about understanding the world around you." A young female with a scar on her arm raised her hand. "But that is not allowed," she whispered. "It is now," Helen said. "In this room, questions are not just allowed. They're required." 3 months had passed since Helen's arrival on Velar Prime. The small classroom at the edge of the education building had changed. The walls were no longer bare. Student drawings covered them now. Questions written on paper hung from strings across the ceiling. A collection of rocks and plants sat on the windowsill, gathered during field trips that had shocked the other instructors. Helen stood by the window, watching her 12 students work in small groups. They were building models of the solar system using whatever materials they could find. And another student named were arguing about the proper distance between planets. Their voices were excited, not angry. "But if we put them too close together, it won't show the real scale," insisted. "Then we need to make the sun smaller or use a bigger space," countered. Helen smiled. This was what learning should sound like. This was the sound of minds engaging with problems instead of just accepting answers. The door opened suddenly. Director entered with instructor. The students immediately fell silent and returned to their seats. Old habits died hard. His dark eyes swept across the room. He looked at the decorations on the walls with obvious disgust. He looked at the materials scattered on the desks. He looked at Helen with something very close to anger. "What is the meaning of this?" he asked. "We're learning about the solar system," Helen said calmly. "Learning is done from books and lectures. This is chaos. This is understanding. There's a difference between memorizing that planets orbit the sun and actually grasping what that means." Walked to his desk and picked up the model he had been building. He turned it over in his hands. "This is incorrect. The proportions are wrong." "He knows that," Helen said. "He's working through the problem of scale. He's learning why it's difficult to represent astronomical distances in a small space. That's a valuable lesson." "There is no value in mistakes. There is only value in correct information." Dropped the model on the desk. One of the planets broke off and rolled across the floor. Flinched but said nothing. "Your methods are unacceptable," continued. "I have received reports from other instructors. They say your students ask questions during meals. They say your students challenge answers given by their other teachers. They say your students create disorder. They think that's all they're doing. They're learning to think. Thinking without knowledge is useless. We provide knowledge, that is education." Helen took a slow breath. She had been preparing for this conversation for weeks. "Director, may I ask you something?" He stared at her coldly. "Speak." "What is the purpose of education?" "To transfer information from teacher to student." "But why? What do you want students to do with that information?" Tilted his head slightly. "To have it, to know it, to be able to repeat it when asked." And after that, what happens when they face a problem they've never seen before? What happens when they need to create something new or solve something that isn't in any book? That does not happen. All necessary information already exists. Students need only learn what is already known. That's not how the universe works, Helen said quietly. Everything that exists was once unknown. Every discovery, every innovation, every solution to every problem started with someone asking a question that had never been asked before. If you only teach students to repeat what's already known, you trap them in the past. The past is safe, the past is proven, the past is correct. The past is dead, Helen said, and if you keep teaching this way, you'll kill the future too. The room fell into complete silence. Every student stared at Helen with wide eyes. No one had ever spoken to director like that. His face remained expressionless, but his hands clenched into fists. You will cease these methods immediately. You will teach from the approved curriculum. You will ensure your students memorize the required facts. If you do not comply, you will be removed from this planet. And if I do comply, what happens to them? Helen gestured to her students. What happens to children who want to understand, not just memorize? What happens to minds that are curious and creative? They will learn discipline. They will learn obedience. They will become useful members of society. They'll become copies of everyone else. They'll lose what makes them special. There is no value in being special. There is only value in being correct. Turned toward the door. You have 1 week to show improvement in their memorization scores. If their test results do not meet minimum standards, you will be expelled from Velar Prime. He left, followed. The door closed with a soft click. Helen looked at her 12 students. They looked back at her with fear in their eyes. Are you going to do what he said? Asked in a small voice. Helen sat down on the edge of her desk. She thought about everything she could say. She thought about being diplomatic, about compromising, about finding a middle ground. Then she thought about what really mattered. No, she said simply. Leaned forward, but he will send you away. Maybe, but I came here to teach you, really teach you, and I'm not going to stop just because someone says I should. Why? Another student asked. Why does it matter so much to you? We are just failures. Helen felt her heart break a little. You're not failures. You're students who were never given a real chance to learn, and I'm a teacher. Teaching isn't just my job, it's who I am. I can't stand in front of curious minds and feed them dead facts when I could help them come alive. But what will happen to you? Asked. I don't know, but what happens to me isn't important. What's important is what happens to you. What you learn here, how you learn to think and question and create, no one can take that away from you. Even if they send me away tomorrow, you'll still have that. Then we will learn, said firmly. We will learn everything you can teach us. The other students nodded in agreement. Helen smiled. Good, because I have a lot to teach you, starting with human history. She walked to the front of the room and began to draw on the board. She drew Earth, small and blue. She drew humans, tiny figures on a dangerous planet. Humans come from a world that tried to kill us, she began. We had no natural weapons. We were not the strongest or the fastest. We were not the at first, but we had something that mattered more than any of that. We had curiosity. We asked why. We asked how. We asked what if. The students listened with complete attention. We looked at fire and didn't just fear it. We asked if we could use it. We looked at the sky and didn't just wonder what was there. We asked if we could reach it. Every single thing humans have ever achieved started with a question. And every time someone told us something was impossible, we asked why. Then we proved them wrong. She turned back to her students. That's what I want to teach you, not facts, not answers, questions, because the right question is worth more than 1,000 memorized facts. Raised his hand. Can we ask any question? Any question at all? Then I want to know something. If humans value questions so much, why did your people send only one teacher here? If you believe this is so important, why not send 100 teachers? Helen paused. It was a very good question. Because your government only agreed to accept one, they saw this as an experiment. They think human teaching is primitive. They think I'll fail. Will you? Asked. I don't know, Helen said honestly. But I'm going to try, and more importantly, you're going to try. We have 1 week until the test. 1 week to show them what you can really do. We are not good at memorization, one of the other students said sadly. That is why we are here. Then we won't focus on memorization. We'll focus on understanding. If you truly understand something, you don't need to memorize it, you just know it. For the next week, Helen worked with her students from early morning until late at night. She taught them to ask why before accepting any answer. She taught them to connect ideas instead of treating every fact as separate. She taught them to find patterns and relationships between different pieces of information. She taught them about Earth's history, about how humans went from caves to space in just 10,000 years, about how human children were encouraged to question their teachers, about how human scientists often made discoveries by accident because they were curious about things that seemed unimportant. She taught them that making mistakes was part of learning, that confusion meant you were on the edge of understanding something new, that the best answer to one question was usually another question. The other instructors reported her activities to the council daily. Students from other classes began to whisper about the human teacher and her strange methods. Some parents demanded their children be removed from her influence. Others quietly wished their children could learn the same way. The week passed too quickly. The day of the test arrived. Director himself came to administer it. He brought the standard exam that all students took. Questions about facts, about dates, about formulas and definitions. Helen's students sat at their desks and picked up their writing tools. Helen stood at the back of the room and watched. She had done everything she could. Now it was up to them. Collected the tests after 2 hours. He did not look at Helen as he left. 3 days later, the results came back. Helen was called to the council chambers. She walked through the silver corridors of the government building with her head high. Whatever happened next, she had no regrets. Director sat at the head of a long table. 6 other council members sat along the sides. They all looked at Helen with cold, unreadable faces. "The test results have been analyzed," said flatly. "Your students scored an average of 43%. This is below the minimum acceptable score of 70%. Your experiment has failed. You will leave Velar Prime within 3 days." Helen felt her stomach drop but kept her face calm. "May I see the results?" "There is no point. The numbers are clear." "I'd still like to see them." Director stared at Helen across the council table. "Explain yourself." Helen set down the data pad and met his gaze. "Your test measures memorization. It asks students to repeat facts. My students can do that, but I didn't teach them to do that. I taught them to think, to understand, to solve problems they've never seen before. Of course, they failed a memorization test. They were learning something completely different." "Facts are facts. What else matters?" "Understanding matters. Application matters. Let me prove it to you." Elder leaned forward slightly. "How would you prove this?" "Give me one chance. Tomorrow is the annual academic assessment day. Let my students demonstrate what they've learned, not through a written test, but through actual problem solving. Let them show you what they can do when they think instead of just remember." His expression hardened. "That is not how assessment works. Students recite what they have learned. That is the tradition." "Then change the tradition for one day. What do you have to lose? You're already sending me away." The council members looked at each other. Silent communication passed between them. Finally, Elder spoke. "I support this proposal. Let us see what the humans' methods have actually produced." 2 other council members nodded in agreement. Jaw tightened, but he was outvoted. "Very well. Your students will have 15 minutes tomorrow during the assessment. If they fail to impress, you will leave immediately. No delays." "Agreed," Helen said. She left the council chambers and ran back to her classroom. Her students were waiting, their faces filled with worry, stood up as soon as she entered. "What happened?" "We have one more chance," Helen said, slightly out of breath. "Tomorrow at the academic assessment, we're going to show them what you can really do." "But we failed the test," said quietly. "You failed their test, but tomorrow you're going to show them what real learning looks like. We have one night to prepare. Are you with me?" Every single student stood up. "Yes," they said together. They worked through the night. Helen helped them prepare presentations, experiments, and demonstrations. She helped them practice explaining their thinking out loud. She reminded them that the goal was not to be perfect. The goal was to show how they could approach problems, how they could reason through challenges, how they could create solutions. As the sun rose over Velar Prime, Helen looked at her exhausted but determined students. "Remember," she said, "you are not failures, you never were. Tomorrow you prove that to everyone." The academic assessment day was the most important event in the education calendar. Families gathered in the Great Hall to watch their children demonstrate what they had learned. The hall was enormous, with seats rising up in circles around a central platform. Every seat was filled. The Education Council sat in a special section at the front, elevated above everyone else. Helen sat in the back with her 12 students. They watched as group after group of students took the platform. Each group was flawless. They recited facts in perfect unison. They answered questions with exact precision. The audience clapped politely after each performance. But Helen noticed something. The audience looked bored. The performances were technically perfect, but they were also completely lifeless. It was like watching machines operate. Finally, it was time. The failure group will now present, director announced. His voice made it clear he expected humiliation. Helen's students walked to the platform. Helen could see their hands shaking. She wanted to go with them, to stand beside them, but this had to be their moment. Stepped forward, he looked small on the big platform. He looked scared, but he began to speak. We are called the failure group because we ask too many questions. We are called failures because we do not memorize well. We are called failures because we think differently. He paused. But today we want to show you that asking questions is not a failure. It is how we learn. He gestured to who brought forward a large board covered with drawings. We were asked to learn about agriculture. Every student memorizes that our planet grows food in specific ways using specific methods. But we asked a different question. We asked if there might be better ways. Pointed to her drawings. I studied how plants grow. I studied the soil. I studied the water cycle. Then I noticed something. We plant our crops in straight lines because that is how it has always been done. But plant roots do not grow in straight lines. They spread out in circles. Another student, a young named, stepped forward. So we asked, what if we planted in circles instead of lines? What if we gave each plant more space for its roots? We did calculations. We made models. We tested it on a small scale using plants we grew ourselves. He showed data on a screen. In our test area, circular planting produced 23% more food using the same amount of space. It also needed less water because the plants shared resources more efficiently. The audience had gone completely silent. This was not recitation. This was original thought. Director stood up. This is unproven theory. It has no value. Elder raised his hand. Let them finish. Spoke again. We know it is theory, but all facts start as theories. Someone has to think of new ideas before they can become facts. That is what humans taught us. Question everything, test everything, never stop asking why. Another student came forward with a musical instrument that Helen had never seen before. I learned about sound waves in class. I memorized all the facts about frequency and amplitude, but I did not understand what those words really meant until our teacher made us create sounds ourselves. The student played a note on the instrument. Then she adjusted something and played the same note at a different frequency. I realized that if I changed the shape of the instrument, I could create sounds that have never been made before on our world. So I built this. She began to play. The music that came out was unlike anything they had ever heard. It was complex and beautiful and completely new. Some of the audience members looked shocked. Others looked moved. When she finished, there was stunned silence. Then slowly a few people began to clap. Then more, then even more. The applause grew until it filled the entire hall. Director looked furious, but he could not deny what everyone had just witnessed. More students came forward. One had written a story, something that students never did. Stories were not facts, so they had no place in education. But this student read his story aloud, a tale about a young who dared to explore beyond the boundaries of the known world. People listened with complete attention. Another student had created art. She had painted a picture of Velar Prime as seen from space, but she had added something extra. She had painted what the planet might look like in the future if they used agricultural methods. More green, more life, more possibility. Another student demonstrated a mathematical proof she had discovered on her own. It was not in any textbook. It was something she had created by asking what would happen if she approached an old problem in a new way. One by one, Helen's students showed what they had learned. Not facts, not memorization, but thinking, real, genuine, creative thinking. When the last student finished, the entire audience was on their feet. They were not clapping politely anymore. They were clapping with real emotion. Some people had tears in their eyes. They had just seen something they thought was impossible. They had seen young create instead of copy. Helen stood in the back, her own eyes wet with tears. She was so proud she thought her heart might burst. Director remained seated. His face showed no emotion, but his hands gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Elder stood and raised his hand for silence. "What we have witnessed today is unprecedented," said. His voice was calm but carried clearly through the hall. "These students were labeled as failures, yet they have demonstrated abilities that surpass simple recitation. They have shown us something we have not seen in generations. They have shown us innovation." "They have shown us chaos," interrupted, standing abruptly. "They have shown us undisciplined thinking. This is not education. This is dangerous." "Dangerous?" Helen could not stay silent anymore. She walked down to the platform, standing beside her students. "What's dangerous about teaching children to think? What's dangerous about encouraging creativity and curiosity? It disrupts order. It challenges authority. It leads to unpredictable outcomes." "Yes," Helen said firmly. "That's exactly what it does, and that's exactly what progress requires. You cannot innovate if you only repeat what has already been done. You cannot solve new problems if you only know old answers." Pointed at Helen with a shaking hand. "You have corrupted these children. You have filled their heads with primitive human ideas. You have made them unfit for our society." "I have taught them to be alive," Helen said. "I have taught them that their minds are not storage units for facts. They are tools for understanding the universe. Every human achievement, from simple fire to space travel, came from someone asking a question and refusing to accept the easy answer. That is not primitive. That is the foundation of all progress." The audience began to murmur. Some voices supported Helen, others supported. The hall filled with the sound of disagreement, something that rarely happened on Velar Prime. Elder raised his hand again. "This matter requires careful consideration. The council will discuss what we have seen today. In the meantime, the human teacher will remain on Velar Prime. No decision will be made hastily." Looked like he wanted to argue, but he was outvoted again. He turned and left the hall, his robes sweeping behind him. Helen's students surrounded her as soon as the council members departed. They were crying and laughing at the same time. "We did it," said, his voice shaking. "We really did it." "You did it," Helen corrected. "I just gave you permission to be yourselves." Looked up at Helen with her large dark eyes. "What happens now?" "I don't know," Helen admitted. "But whatever happens, you've already changed things. You've shown everyone what's possible. That can never be taken back." As the crowd filed out of the hall, Helen noticed something. Parents were talking to each other in excited voices. Young were asking their parents questions, real questions, not just requesting facts. Teachers were standing in small groups, looking uncertain and confused, but also, perhaps, a little bit curious. Seeds had been planted. Helen did not know if they would grow, but she knew that at least some of them would take root. Change was always slow, but it was also inevitable once it began. That night, Helen received a message on her data pad. It was from a parent she had never met. The message was short. "My daughter attended the assessment today. She came home and asked me why we do things the way we do them. I did not have a good answer. Thank you for teaching her to ask. I did not know children could do that." Helen smiled and saved the message. Then another message came, then another. By morning, she had received 47 messages from parents, teachers, and citizens. Some were angry, some were supportive, but all of them were thinking, all of them were questioning. The days following the academic assessment were unlike anything Velar Prime had experienced in living memory. The education building buzzed with tension. Traditional instructors huddled in corners, speaking in low voices. Students whispered in hallways. Parents showed up demanding meetings with the council. The ordered world of the was cracking. Helen continued teaching her 12 students, but now her classroom door was locked. Director had ordered it sealed during her lessons. No other students were allowed near. No other teachers were permitted to observe. He was trying to contain what he saw as contamination. But information, once released, is impossible to contain. On the 5th day after the assessment, Helen arrived at her classroom to find it empty. Her students were gone. Panic hit her hard. She ran through the corridors, searching. Finally, she found them in the main courtyard. They were not alone. 50 other students surrounded them, all asking questions. "How did you learn to think like that?" one young asked. "The human teacher showed us," explained. She taught us that questions are more important than answers. But we are not allowed to ask questions in class, another student said. Then ask them anyway, replied. What are they going to do? Call us failures. We are already called that, but we have learned more in 3 months than we learned in years of memorization. A traditional instructor appeared and began shouting at the students to return to their classes. Most of them obeyed, but they left looking back over their shoulders. Seeds of doubt had been planted in their minds. Helen returned to her classroom with her students. As they settled in, looked worried. They are afraid of what we represent. Of course they are, Helen said. Change is always frightening to people who benefit from the way things are. The instructors have been teaching the same way for decades. If your way is better, it means their way is wrong. That is a hard thing for anyone to accept. That afternoon, Helen was summoned to the council chambers. She knew this was not going to be pleasant. She was right. Director stood at the head of the table, surrounded by other traditional instructors. Only Elder represented a different viewpoint. The room felt hostile. Helen Carter began formally, you have violated the terms of your cultural exchange. You were brought here to teach a small group of defective students. Instead, you have spread disorder throughout our education system. Students question their teachers. They refuse to memorize properly. They waste time on creative pursuits instead of learning facts. This ends now. They are learning, Helen said calmly, just not what you want them to learn. They are learning rebellion. They are learning chaos. Yesterday, 3 students in instructor's class asked why they needed to memorize the chemical formulas instead of understanding what they meant. This morning, a student in instructor's class suggested a different way to solve a mathematics problem. This is unacceptable. This is progress. This is infection, snapped, his emotionless mask finally cracking. You have infected our youth with dangerous ideas. You have made them dissatisfied with perfection. You have taught them to question authority. I have taught them to think. If that threatens your authority, perhaps your authority deserves to be questioned. Slammed his hand on the table. The sound echoed through the chamber. You will cease all teaching activities immediately. Your students will be reassigned to proper instructors who will correct the damage you have done. You will remain confined to your quarters until transport can be arranged to return you to Earth. You cannot just undo what they have learned, Helen said. You cannot make them forget how to think. We can teach them discipline. We can teach them obedience. We can reprogram them to function properly. They are not machines to be, they are children. They are defective units that need correction, that is all. Helen felt cold anger rise in her chest. Is that really how you see them? As defective units? That is what they are. That is what they have always been. You simply made them worse. Elder finally spoke. Director, perhaps we should consider that these students have demonstrated abilities we did not know they possessed. Is that not worth investigating? There is nothing to investigate. Ability without discipline is worthless. These students may have learned to create, but they have lost the ability to obey. That makes them more dangerous, not more valuable. So you would rather have obedient students than capable ones? Helen asked. I would rather have functional citizens than chaos-causing individuals. Our society works because everyone follows the same rules, learns the same way, thinks the same thoughts. What you teach destroys that harmony. That is not harmony, that is stagnation. It is stability, it is safety, it is the foundation of our civilization. Turn to the other council members. I call for an immediate vote. The human teacher must be removed. Her methods must be banned. Her students must be corrected. All in favor. 6 hands rose. Only Elder kept his hand down. The decision is made, said with satisfaction. Helen Carter, you are expelled from Velar Prime. Security will escort you to your quarters. You will not contact your students. You will not teach anyone. You will leave within 2 days. Helen wanted to argue, but she knew it was pointless. She had lost. She stood and walked toward the door. As she reached it, Elder spoke quietly. May I speak with the human before she is confined? Waved his hand dismissively. 5 minutes, no more. Outside the chamber, Elder walked beside Helen in silence. Finally, he said, what you have done here will not be forgotten. It will be erased. You heard him. They will reprogram my students. They will try, but ideas once planted are difficult to kill. You have given those children something precious. Even if they are forced to hide it, they will carry it with them. That is not enough, Helen said, her voice breaking. They deserve better than hiding what they are. Perhaps, but change does not happen in one generation. You have started something. That is all any teacher can do. Helen was escorted to her quarters by 2 security officers. The door was sealed from the outside. She sat on her narrow bed and stared at the blank walls. She had failed. After everything, she had failed. Hours passed. Night fell. Helen did not sleep. She thought about her 12 students and what would happen to them. She thought about curiosity, creativity, analytical mind. She thought about all of that being crushed under the weight of forced memorization and obedience training. At midnight, she heard voices outside her door, shouting. Her door suddenly opened, stood there, breathing hard. Behind him were all 11 of his classmates. "What are you doing?" Helen asked, shocked. "We are not going to let them take you," said firmly. "You cannot stop this. They will just punish you too. We do not care. You taught us to question. You taught us to stand up for what is right. Well, this is not right. They cannot send you away for teaching us to think." "We are going to the council building," added. "We are going to tell them that if they send you away, they will have to send us away too." "No," Helen said firmly. "Do not throw away your futures for me." "What future?" asked. "A future of memorizing facts we do not understand. A future of being called failures because we ask questions. That is not a future worth keeping." Before Helen could stop them, they left. She ran after them, but the security officers blocked her way. "You must remain in your quarters," one said. "My students are going to do something foolish. I need to stop them." "They are no longer your students. They are being reassigned." Helen pushed past them and ran. She had to catch her students before they did something that would ruin their lives. But she was too late. By the time she reached the council building, her 12 students stood on the front steps. But they were not alone. Hundreds of young surrounded them. Students from all across the education system had come. They were not rioting. They were not destroying anything. They were simply standing there holding signs written in simple words. "Let us learn. Questions are not crimes. Teach us to think." Helen pushed through the crowd until she reached her students. "What have you done?" "What you taught us to do," said. "We asked why. Why should thinking be forbidden? Why should curiosity be punished? Why should one teacher be sent away for showing us a better path? We could not find good answers to those questions, so we decided to act." The council building doors opened. Director emerged, flanked by security. He looked at the crowd with barely controlled fury. "Disperse immediately. Return to your homes. This gathering is forbidden." No one moved. "I will have every one of you expelled from the education system," threatened. "Then expel us," a student from the crowd shouted. "We would rather be expelled than go back to memorizing without understanding." Other voices joined in agreement. The crowd's energy grew. This was unprecedented. Young did not protest. They did not challenge authority. They obeyed, but not tonight. Elder emerged from the building behind. He looked at the crowd with an expression that might have been wonder. "Director, perhaps we should listen to them." "Listen to children? They know nothing. They have been corrupted by primitive human thinking." "Have they? Or have they simply awakened to something we forgot long ago?" "What are you talking about?" demanded. "I have been researching our history," said slowly. "Ancient records, documents from before the Great War. Do you know what I found?" "History is irrelevant to this situation." "On the contrary, it is entirely relevant." Turned to address the crowd. 300 years ago, before the war, education was different. Students were encouraged to question. Creative thinking was valued. Innovation was celebrated. Our civilization flourished. The crowd fell silent, listening. "Then the war came," continued. "We needed soldiers who would obey without question. We needed citizens who would follow orders. We needed unity, not individuality. So we changed our education system. We taught obedience instead of curiosity, memorization instead of understanding. It was supposed to be temporary, just until the war ended." "But the war ended 200 years ago," said quietly. "Yes," confirmed. "But we never changed back. We forgot that there was ever another way. We forgot what we lost. Until tonight when I saw all of you standing here and I realized something. You are not corrupted. You are not broken. You are what we used to be, what we were always meant to be." Director stood frozen. His face showed more emotion than Helen had ever seen, from a shock, confusion, and something that might have been pain. "That cannot be true," he whispered. I can show you the records. Everything is documented. We did this to ourselves, and we forgot we had done it. The crowd began murmuring. Parents who had come looking for their children heard everything. Traditional instructors who had come to support now looked uncertain. Helen stood with her students and watched as an entire society confronted its hidden past. She did not speak. This moment belonged to them, not to her. Helen stood on the council building steps, surrounded by hundreds of young and her 12 students. Director had just asked her the question that might change everything. What would she have them do? She took a slow breath. This moment felt impossibly heavy. I would have you remember something important. I am not the answer. Human teaching methods are not the answer. There is no single answer. That is the whole point. The crowd listened in complete silence. Every species, every culture, every civilization has something unique to offer. Value discipline and precision. Those are good things. Humans value creativity and questioning. Those are also good things. The mistake is thinking you have to choose one or the other. The best education system would combine the strengths of both. She looked at, you are not wrong for valuing discipline. Structure and order matter, but not at the cost of curiosity, not at the cost of joy in learning, not at the cost of individual thought. Was quiet for a long moment, then he nodded slowly. Call an emergency council meeting, all members immediately. The crowd waited outside while the council gathered inside. Helen was invited to attend. She sat at the long table, no longer as a prisoner but as a participant. Elder projected the ancient records he had found onto the walls. The council members read in silence. The evidence was undeniable. They had once taught the way Helen taught. They had valued questions, creativity, innovation. Then the war came and fear changed everything. Fear of losing, fear of chaos, fear of individuality leading to division. We sacrificed our future for temporary security, one council member said quietly, and we forgot we had done it. The question now, said, is whether we have the courage to change back. Change is dangerous, another member argued. If we allow too much freedom in education, we risk losing our social cohesion. We risk conflict and disorder. We already have conflict, Helen pointed out. Hundreds of students are standing outside right now, refusing to return to the old way. You cannot force them back into a system they have seen through. They know there is another way now. The only question is whether you acknowledge that or try to suppress it. And if we acknowledge it, said slowly, what then? We cannot simply abandon our entire education system overnight. We have thousands of teachers who only know the old methods. We have millions of students already trained in memorization. How do we change something so vast? The same way humans went from caves to space, Helen replied. One step at a time, one teacher at a time, one student at a time. You do not need to change everything immediately. You just need to start. How? Helen thought carefully. Start with choice. Allow parents and students to choose between traditional education and a new approach. Let both systems exist side by side. Some students will thrive with structure and memorization. Others will thrive with creativity and questioning. Give them options. And who would teach this new way? Another council member asked. We have no instructors trained in such methods. Then train them. I can help with that. I can teach your teachers how to encourage questions instead of suppress them, how to foster understanding instead of just memorization, how to recognize and nurture different types of intelligence. The council members looked at each other. Silent communication passed between them. Finally spoke. I call for a vote. Should we implement a dual education system allowing both traditional and progressive methods? All in favor. One by one hands rose, not all of them but enough. 5 out of 7, it was done. Looked exhausted. I vote against, but I am outvoted. The motion passes. He turned to Helen. You will need to stay longer than planned. Training teachers will take time. I will stay as long as needed, Helen said. But there is something you need to understand. This cannot be about humans teaching. This needs to be about rediscovering what they already knew. My job is to remind you, not to replace you. Over the next 3 months, everything changed and nothing changed. The traditional education system continued as it always had. But alongside it, a new system grew. Teachers volunteered to learn different methods. Parents enrolled their children in experimental programs. Students who had been labeled failures suddenly excelled. Helen worked 16 hours a day, training instructors who had spent their entire careers teaching one way and now had to learn another. It was hard. Many of them struggled. Some quit. But others discovered something they had never known they were capable of. They discovered that teaching could be joyful, that watching a student understand something for the first time was worth more than watching them memorize perfectly. And his 11 classmates became assistants in the training program. They showed the traditional teachers what progressive learning looked like from a student's perspective. They explained how questions made them engaged instead of confused, how making mistakes helped them learn better than always being correct. Not everyone was happy. Traditional families protested. Some instructors refused to change. Parts of society resisted fiercely. But slowly, gradually, the new system proved itself. Students in progressive programs began creating things no one had seen before. They designed new technologies. They wrote stories and music. They solved problems that had stumped traditional scholars. Most importantly, they were happy. They wanted to learn instead of dreading it. 6 months after the night of the protest, Helen received an official communication from the government. They wanted her to become the permanent director of progressive education. They wanted her to stay on Velar Prime indefinitely to oversee the transformation of their entire system. Helen sat in her small room, which was no longer bare but filled with student artwork and gifts, and thought about the offer. It was everything she had worked for, everything she had hoped to achieve, but something felt wrong. She called a meeting with the council. "I am honored by your offer," she told them, "but I must decline." Who had slowly become an unexpected ally looked surprised. "Why? You have proven yourself invaluable. Your presence ensures the success of these reforms." "That is exactly the problem," Helen said. "As long as I am here, this is the human teacher's system. It is the method that Helen Carter brought from Earth. That makes it foreign. That makes it something imposed from outside." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the education buildings. "But this is not a human method. It is a method. It is your own history reclaimed. As long as I am the face of these changes, people can dismiss them as alien influence. They can say you are copying humans instead of rediscovering yourselves." "You believe your absence will strengthen the movement?" Elder asked. "Yes, what I have taught you are principles, not procedures. How to encourage questioning, how to foster creativity, how to recognize that different minds learn differently. Those principles are not human, or they are universal, but you need to apply them in ways. You need to develop your own progressive methods, rooted in your own culture and history." "You would leave your own success?" asked, and there was something in his voice that might have been respect. "It is not my success. It is yours. I was only the spark. You are the fire." The council accepted her decision, though not happily. A farewell ceremony was planned for the following week. Helen spent her last days saying goodbye to the students and teachers she had worked with. It was harder than she had expected. She had grown to love this strange, rigid world and the people who were learning to be less rigid. On her final evening, her 12 students came to her quarters. They brought gifts, handmade items, artwork, written stories, tokens of gratitude. Spoke for all of them. "You changed our lives. You showed us that we were not failures, that we could be more than what we were told. How do we thank you for that?" "You thank me by teaching others," Helen said. "By becoming teachers yourselves. By never letting anyone forget that questions are precious, that curiosity is strength, that different minds are gifts, not problems." "We will," promised. "Everything you taught us we will pass on." "Not everything I taught you," Helen corrected gently. "Pass on the principles, but teach them your own way, make them yours." The farewell ceremony was held in the great hall where Helen's students had first demonstrated their abilities. The hall was packed, not just with education officials, but with ordinary citizens, parents, students, teachers both traditional and progressive. Director, who had once wanted her expelled, now gave a speech in her honor. "Helen Carter came to our world as an outsider. She left as a teacher who reminded us of something we had forgotten about ourselves. She gave us no facts. She provided no formulas. She simply asked us to remember what it means to truly learn. For that, we are forever grateful." Helen stood to speak her last words to the people. "I came here expecting to teach. Instead, I learned something more important. Every species, every culture has wisdom. Humans do not have all the answers. Neither does anyone. The key to true progress is not believing your way is the only way. It is learning from each other while staying true to yourselves." She looked at her 12 students sitting in the front row. "These children taught me that labels do not define us. They were called failures, but they became teachers. They were called defective, but they became innovators. Do not let anyone tell you what you cannot be. Do not let fear prevent you from questioning. Do not let comfort stop you from growing. She paused, emotion catching in her throat. I leave you with one request. Do not preserve what I taught you like a sacred text. Do not follow my methods like rules. Instead, question them. Improve them, change them, make them better. That is what learners do. That is what teachers do. That is what living cultures do. Thank you for letting me be part of your transformation. But remember, the transformation is not finished. It will never be finished. Learning is not a destination. It is a journey. Keep walking. The applause that followed was different from the polite clapping Helen had heard when she first arrived. This was genuine. This was heartfelt. This was the sound of people who had been changed and knew it. 2 days later, Helen boarded the transport ship that would take her back to human space. As Velar Prime shrank in the viewport, she allowed herself to cry, not from sadness, but from pride, from hope, from the knowledge that she had done what every teacher dreams of doing. She had made a difference. Years passed. Helen returned to teaching human students on Earth. She shared stories of Velar Prime with her classes. She taught them the same lesson they had learned, that the universe is full of different minds, different ways of thinking, different approaches to learning, and that was beautiful, not frightening. She received regular updates from Velar Prime. The progressive education system had spread. 50% of students now learned through questioning and creativity rather than pure memorization. The economy boomed as innovative young minds developed new technologies. Art and literature flourished. Scientific discoveries accelerated. More importantly, the cultural shift continued. Young grew up in a world where asking questions was valued, where being different was seen as an asset, where failure was understood as part of learning rather than a permanent label. Director, who had once been her greatest opponent, had become one of the strongest advocates for educational diversity. He retired from his position, but spent his final years writing about the importance of balancing discipline with creativity, order with curiosity. Became a teacher, just as he had promised, but he did not teach the way Helen had taught. He took the principles she had given him and made them uniquely. He developed methods that honored his culture's love of precision while embracing curiosity. Other teachers studied his approach and adapted it further. Became an artist and agricultural scientist. She used her creative mind to develop farming techniques that fed millions. She proved that art and science were not opposites but partners. The other students went on to their own successes, each finding their own path. Not because Helen had shown them the way, but because she had taught them to find their own ways. 10 years after leaving Velar Prime, Helen received a message marked urgent. She opened it with trembling hands. It was from now a respected educator with students of his own. The message was simple. Teacher Helen, you should know that students have begun attending Earth universities as exchange students. They are learning from humans as you learned from us. Some human students are also coming to Velar Prime. The exchange goes both ways now. What you started has grown beyond either species. We are learning from each other. I wanted to tell you something else. I recently met with a group of young students who struggled with traditional learning. I told them about you, about how one human teacher saw past their labels and recognized their potential. One of them asked me, did she save you? I told them, no, you did not save us. You reminded us how to save ourselves. Thank you for that. Thank you for teaching us to think. We are teaching others now, as you asked. Helen read the message 3 times. Then she sat back in her chair and smiled. She thought about a young boy named who had asked why. She thought about a scared human teacher who had dared to answer that question. She thought about how one classroom in one corner of the galaxy had rippled outward to touch 2 civilizations. She had been the last human teacher on Velar Prime, but she had not been the last teacher. They had found their own teachers, their own methods, their own path forward. They had taken the spark she offered and built their own fire. That was the greatest lesson of all. A good teacher does not create dependence. A good teacher creates more teachers, and those teachers create still more. The learning never stops. The questions never end. The growth continues, generation after generation, spreading across worlds and species. Helen Carter closed the message and opened a new file. She had a class to teach tomorrow. Human students who needed to learn the same lesson her students had learned, that they were capable of more than they knew, that questions were precious, that their differences were strengths. That learning was not about being told what to think, but discovering how to think. One teacher cannot transform a world, but one teacher can light a spark. And if that spark finds the right kindling, if it is tended by many hands, if it is passed from person to person and world to world, it can become something magnificent. It can become a fire that burns away ignorance and fear, a fire that illuminates new possibilities, a fire that warms hearts and minds across the galaxy. Helen had been the spark, but they had built the fire themselves, and now that fire burned bright enough to light the way for others. That was the power of teaching. That was the gift of education. That was the hope of the future. One question at a time, one student at a time, one world at a time, forever. Finally spoke again. His voice was different now, quieter, more human. I was taught the old way is the only way. Everything I am, everything I have done was based on that belief. If you are right, then I have been wrong my entire life. I have failed every student I ever taught. You taught what you were taught, said gently. You cannot be blamed for not knowing what was deliberately hidden, but now we know. The question is, what do we do with that knowledge? Looked at Helen. For the first time, she saw something other than coldness in his eyes. She saw uncertainty, she saw fear, she saw the beginning of doubt. What would you have us do? He asked her. The transformation had begun. One of the other council members, an older named, pushed a data pad across the table. Helen picked it up and read through the scores. What she saw made her heart sink. Then she looked closer. Then she started to smile. These scores, she said slowly, are measuring the wrong things. She saw it then, the smallest spark of something coming alive in their eyes. It was not much, but it was enough to start with. Helen Carter had no idea that this moment, in this small room with these 12 so-called failures, would change an entire world. She only knew that she had found students worth teaching, and that was all she needed.